Hello, hello. I guess I don't really need the microphone that much. Okay. So I'm Dr. Robert Spicer from the Communication and Theater Department. I want to thank you for coming to the Voter Access Voter Rights panel, and especially thank you for coming to the 9:25 a.m. panel, which is always the first panel of the morning is always the hardest one to make it to, I suppose, depending on what you did the night before also. So I was thinking about like the opening remarks for what I was going to say today. And not quite sure over the last couple of days how to open it up, and then fate dropped in my lap a nice way to open this up. So at some point yesterday or the day before in Indiana, there was a raid on a voter registration organization by state police in Indiana, claiming that they were engaged in fraudulent voter registration practices, and apparently there's an allegation that they had a handful of fraudulent voter registration forms. And I pulled some quotes from this article on Talking Points Memo, a political website, about this. They write, in Indiana, an investigation into alleged voter registration fraud intensified rapidly Tuesday when state police reportedly raided the Indianapolis office of voter registration group and confiscated computers, personal cell phones, and paperwork, according to a report from The Intercept, a newspaper in Indiana. What is unusual, election law experts say, is for police to raid a voter registration office, and the proximity of the raid to the election seemed troubling. Daniel Tokaji, an elections law professor at Ohio State, said he was worried that such a raid, if it happened in the manner described in the news reports, could have a chilling effect on other voter registration drives across the country. Quote, my concern is it is going to intimidate people who are registering people to vote. Tokaji argued that while limiting early voting and requiring photo ID all had negative effects on voter turnout, launching an investigation like the one in Indiana, which has essentially stopped the group from registering voters, represented a new level of potential voter suppression. Quote, there's nothing that affects voter turnout on election day more than voter registration. Voting registration is really the big thing. If you make it more difficult to register, you will decrease the number of people who vote. These sorts of law enforcement activities are extremely worrisome. And this is why a panel like this is so important, why this discussion is so important to talk about just having access to our right to vote, and thinking about the ways in which political forces suppress that, and the ways in which it's done subtly through voter ID laws, and the ways that it's even openly admitted by politicians like here in Pennsylvania with Mike Turzai, who a couple years ago flat out said the voter ID law was passed to help Mitt Romney win the state. When we have forces like this working against getting people registered to vote and making it so people can vote, that's problematic for the country, and that's why I think this is a really important panel. I'm glad that you all came. So our first speaker is Marian Schneider, who was appointed Deputy Secretary for Elections and Administration in the Pennsylvania Department of State on February 2nd, 2015. Ms. Schneider has led substantial improvements in the department's services to voters, including the introduction of online voter registration, which since its launch has more than 675,000 Pennsylvanians using it to register to vote or update an existing registration. The online application includes a feature that permits those without PennDOT driver's license to upload an image of their signature. Prior to her appointment, Ms. Schneider litigated several high-impact voting rights cases. She was trial counsel in Applewhite v. Commonwealth, a suit successfully challenging Pennsylvania's voter ID law. She also represented the plaintiffs in English v. Chester County, a successful 2008 case under the Voting Rights Act in Chester County that was about moving a polling place from a smaller polling place to a larger polling place. She received her JD from George Washington University, where she was a member of the Law Review, and she earned her BA cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania. So we'll start with Ms. Schneider, and we'll hear from Patrick second, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So please welcome Marian Schneider. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spicer. And thank you all for coming out this morning. I appreciate your coming. So who all is registered to vote? Raise your hands. All right, 100%. that's good, because at the end of this, we'll go through how to register. We're going to talk about some of the things the department is doing, but I'm living proof that elections matter, because 4 years ago, I was litigating the voter ID case, and now I'm in the Department of State making sure that we expand access for voter registration. So every election matters, not just the presidential, but all the way in, and especially in odd-numbered year elections. So just to segue, we're going to dig a little bit deep into the voter ID case that was litigated here in Pennsylvania. But just as kind of a background, this map that I'm showing you shows the restrictive voting laws that were passed before the 2012 elections. And all of those states passed something. The ones with the stars were subject to litigation, and those were not in effect for the election. But that was in 2012, and those included voter ID restrictions, 11 states, proof of citizenship in 3 states, restrictions to early voting in 5 states. We don't have early voting in Pennsylvania. We're one of 13 states that do not. But in most of the rest of the country, there's a period of time where voters can show up and vote before Election Day. And these laws restricted either how many days were available for early voting, or the locations that were available, or put other restrictions on the ability to vote. This map is the 2013 map. As you can see, it's even getting bigger. And this is updated because North Carolina rolled back. They had some of the most expansive rules for voting that were passed in 2007, and in the period from 2007 to 2013, their voter participation rate skyrocketed. But in 2013, they removed many of those. They put in strict voter ID, reduced early voting, took away pre-registration for voters. Some of these cases have been wending their way through the courts, and the Fourth Circuit, I think, has overturned many of these laws. This is 2014, a map showing this activity continues to go at the state legislative level. And finally, this is the 2016 map. And again, these are the kinds of laws we're talking about: strict photo ID laws, proof of citizenship laws, making voter registration harder, just like the example Dr. Spicer gave you, reducing early voting, making it harder for students to vote. There are some jurisdictions who have introduced legislation to tie tuition benefits to what state a student decides to register in. And also making voter purges worse, trying to remove people from the rolls based on either database matching or some other kind of method that may, in its broad sweep, remove otherwise eligible voters. So with that as a background, I just want to dive a little bit deeper into Pennsylvania's voter ID law. So in 2012, Act 18 of 2012 was Pennsylvania's voter ID law. It was signed into law in March, not too far in front of the primary. The primaries are early in presidential year, so it was only a little more than a month before the presidential primary. And the law had a provision for a soft rollout during that primary. In other words, the soft rollout was that poll workers would ask voters for a photo ID, but if they didn't have it, they would still be allowed to vote, but they would be told that next time they came, they would need a photo ID. So that actually occurred because our lawsuit wasn't filed until May, and so that increased the voter confusion surrounding, do I need an ID or do I not need an ID? That was the House Bill 934 was the bill. Just want to review some of the provisions of the law with you. So the most publicized and the most important provision of this law was that every voter was going to be required to show a photo ID at the polling place. And it was a limited list of acceptable IDs that you could have. There's a slide a little bit later that shows the number of IDs. And if you didn't have that ID, there was no safety net. If you didn't have an ID, you had to vote by provisional ballot, and you had 6 days to show up, or either you could mail it, fax it, or provide a copy of your ID to the Board of Elections, the County Board of Elections. There were only two exceptions. One is if you had a religious belief that prevented you from being photographed, or two, if you could sign an affidavit in which you said you were indigent and that you couldn't obtain an ID without paying a fee and couldn't afford to pay the fee. But since IDs were offered for free, allegedly for free, the number of people who were going to be able to take advantage of that, truthfully, was going to be low. So one of the things I want to talk about today is these are the arguments in favor of the need for a strict voter ID requirement, and then I'm going to go through some of the evidence in the case that really refuted all of these points. So proponents of voter ID say most people have a photo ID. You need a photo ID. You needed to buy Sudafed. You needed to do pretty much anything when you go to the doctors. Photo ID is asked for all the time. That may be true, but they're not restricted. The kind of ID you can show is not restricted as it was in this law. Secondly, photo IDs are needed to prevent, quote, voter fraud, unquote. But there's only one kind of voter fraud that photo ID can prevent, and that is in-person impersonation at the polls. In other words, you show up to the polls and you say you're somebody else. That's the only kind of voter fraud that it can prevent, and we'll see later that the evidence of that is extremely rare. The other argument that the proponents and the government made in this case was that the law does not burden a fundamental right, and it's rationally related to a legitimate state interest. In legal terms, that's a very lenient standard for judging the constitutionality of a statute. And the argument is that this is just an election administration rule, and it's not something that burdens a fundamental right. And finally, voter ID protects the integrity of the process. We need to make sure that eligible voters vote, but only eligible voters vote, and that's what a photo voter ID does. These are the arguments in favor of it. So this screen shows you the list of acceptable IDs, and it's a limited list. It had to be a photo ID issued by the U.S. government or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The primary ID they were looking for is a driver's license or a non-driver photo ID. The examples are U.S. passport, a U.S. military ID, an employee photo ID, but only if it was issued by a federal Pennsylvania or Pennsylvania county or municipal government. So school district IDs are missing here. A student ID was okay, but only if it was from a Pennsylvania accredited university. And finally, a photo ID issued by a Pennsylvania care facility, which is a term of art. It's defined. They're facilities where seniors live. But all of those IDs had to have an expiration date. And there was only one exception. Military IDs could say that they were indefinite expiration date. And a driver's license could be expired for 1 year. But those were the only exceptions. At the time the law was passed, the vast majority of colleges and universities did not have an expiration date on the face of their ID. So those would not have been able to be used. Moreover, a private employer ID was not available for use, nor was a Veterans Association ID. So some of the list is short, and not every photo ID was available to use for voting. Furthermore, Pennsylvania's voter ID law was one of the most restrictive in the nation. This slide shows Georgia. There were safety nets in other states. In Georgia, you could vote by absentee ballot without a photo ID, every voter. In Michigan, you could sign an affidavit at the polls and still vote a regular ballot. In Indiana, all voters older than 65 could vote absentee by mail without a photo ID. None of this applied in Pennsylvania. You had to have a photo ID. For absentee, you didn't have to have a photo ID for absentee voting. Under Act 18, it changed the requirements on your absentee ballot application. You have to put in your driver's license number or the last four of your social. That's still the law, because most people, if they don't have a driver's license, they at least know the last four digits of their social security number. So that part of the law was not challenged. And that's the same requirement that we have right now in Pennsylvania for registering to vote. If you don't have either one of those numbers, then you do go back to that restrictive list of IDs. But actually, that's a picture of the trial team on the first day of the trial. The woman sitting in the motorized wheelchair is Vivian Applewhite. She was the named plaintiff. She was in her 90s at the time of the trial, and she didn't have a photo ID or any ability to get one because her her names didn't match. Her birth certificate, she didn't have a social security card, and she couldn't get one because her birth certificate name was different than every other piece of information she'd had. She had been adopted. She couldn't connect the dots between the names, and she was unable to get her social security card, and therefore, also, since her she didn't have the social security card, and her birth certificate name didn't match the name she was currently using, it was impossible for her to get an ID. The grounds for challenging the law were purely under the state constitution. The U.S. Constitution does not have a textual guarantee of the right to vote, but many state constitutions do, and that's Pennsylvania's constitutional provision. Elections shall be free and equal, and no power, civil or military, shall at any time interfere to prevent the free exercise of the right of suffrage. We argued that that's a fundamental right, and that this was a burden on a fundamental right, and it had to be narrowly tailored to meet a compelling state interest. And that basically that's the crux of the legal argument in the case. I just wanted to, if we can talk a little bit about some of these. The plaintiffs or petitioners are on the left-hand side. All of them had a story. I just told you Vivian Applewhite's. Walola Lee had a similar story of not being able to get her social security card because her birth certificate didn't match. Actually, Walola Lee, this is very common. In the Jim Crow South, many African Americans were born at home. They never were issued a birth certificate. So if you need to get an ID, to get your driver's license, you have to bring your birth certificate. To get a non-driver photo ID, which was that was the default ID, you had to show a birth certificate. A lot of people don't have them and can't get them because they have no record of their birth. Their births maybe were written in the front of the Bible. Joyce Block, she was another person whose social security card and her birth certificate names didn't match, and they didn't match the names on her current utility bills or the deed to her house, and all she had to connect the dots was a ketubah, which is the Hebrew document of a marriage, and it was written in Hebrew characters, and so PennDOT wouldn't accept it. But the way she got her ID was because she was friends with a state senator who called the PennDOT office and said, give her the ID. And so that kind of led to this whole discretion. So we were putting the ability of people's right to vote in the hands of clerks who could exercise discretion based on the documents that they were presented to them. B. Bookler, 92 years old at the time she testified, didn't drive, most of these people don't drive anymore, didn't have a driver's license, had moved into an assisted living facility, had no documentation, and really she could go next door to vote, she could easily go next door to vote, but she couldn't travel to the PennDOT location easily and wait in line in order to get an ID. It is burdensome to go. Asher Shore was an individual who was transitioning to a different gender and whose gender identity didn't match the photo on the photo ID, and so that was going to present some difficulty at the polls. I want to talk about two other witnesses. Taylor Floria, an 18-year-old young man who was on the autism spectrum and actually tried. He lived an hour from the location where he could get an ID. He actually tried to go, but the sensory stimulation was too great in the PennDOT center. They had to leave. They really tried, but there was no way he was going to be able to wait there and get an ID because he just couldn't. It was too much. Danny Rosa was an Air Force veteran, never drove. He lived in the borough of Westchester, Pennsylvania, walked everywhere, voted for 20 years. He worked, he had a job. He became disabled, so he wasn't working at the time. But he had a VA card. He had a photo ID from the Veterans Administration, accepted at every hospital in the country. not acceptable for voting. His birth certificate had his grandmother's surname, which was different than Rosa. He used Rosa his entire life. It was on his VA card, it was on everything else. And he couldn't connect the dots between his birth certificate and his other IDs without going to New York State Court and petitioning the court to issue him a birth certificate in the correct name, which would have been expensive. And he went twice in one day to PennDOT to try to get them to give him an ID, and they refused. And so these are the kinds of stories, and these are just, we had 64 witnesses either testify in person, by video, or by affidavit, and all of them demonstrating that they were going to have difficulty, or it took them a long time to get ID. So that's the my burden slide. One of the arguments that proponents makes is that everybody has ID. We need it for everything. This slide shows the results of a survey that was conducted in June of 2012. And that survey, and it's an estimate, shows that there were over 1 million people who, eligible voters, who didn't have photo ID. Now, survey data is not always the most reliable, but the state did a match, and they took the voter registration database and they matched it to the Department of Motor Vehicle database, so they could see how many registered voters weren't in PennDOT's database. Because the survey data showed that if you didn't have a driver's license or a PennDOT ID, you were much less likely to have any other kind of ID. So this slide shows the match. So they had 8.2 million voter records. Out of that, there were only 4.5 million had an exact match. Another 2.7 million was like probably a match. That left 889,000 that did not match. And then there were some records in Sure that they had a PennDOT, even though they didn't match, they had a PennDOT ID because the person provided it. But there was another 130,000 those IDs didn't match. So the number of unmatched voters that was disclosed by the Department of State was 750,000. That's a lot of people. This was a slide we used at trial. That shows that there were an additional, these were not included in the match, but there were an additional 574,000 voters in the voter file that had an expired ID. So the total was 1.4 million. That was just based on the state's records. Now, there's going to be some discrepancies. So just as by way of background, there were actually 3 trials. We had a preliminary injunction trial in 2012. We had a second hearing after the Supreme Court ruled, and then we had a trial on the merits in 2013, and we hired an expert to do a better match of the database. And even that expert came up with 511,000 that didn't match, and 143,000 of those people actually voted in 2012, and they didn't have a PennDOT ID. So that's really what we're talking about, potential for 143,000 people to lose their fundamental right to vote. It became apparent as the voter ID bill was rolled out that people weren't going to be able to get it because they didn't have the foundational documents, just like some of the examples that I gave you. So these are some of the steps they tried to do to change, to make it better. They said, oh, well, if you were born in Pennsylvania, you don't need your birth certificate, we'll pull it off of vital records. Okay, well, that's great if you're born in Pennsylvania, but if you were born somewhere else, that didn't help. If you formerly had a Pennsylvania driver's license and they could find you in PennDOT's database, you didn't need any documents, they would just take that one. That kind of goes back to the integrity issue because it's sort of like a double standard and kind of a discretionary thing for PennDOT to do. The Pennsylvania colleges and universities were allowed to issue stickers for their IDs. So if you had a sticker of the expiration date, not everybody did it. I think most of the major universities did agree to do that. The Department of State decided to introduce its own just for voting ID, but there was still, there were limited verification requirements, but you still had to go to PennDOT to get it. And that's the bottom line. So we're going to show a series of maps. Here's a map of Pennsylvania counties. Those counties have no driver's license center. You could only get a photo ID at a driver's license center, and there's only 70, I think 72 or 77 of them across the state. So they have none. These counties have a driver's license center that's only open 1 day a week. And those counties have a driver's license center that's only open 2 days a week. So basically that means about 30, like half of the state has a driver's license center that's only open 2 days a week in order to get a valid ID, and you have to get there. So people who don't have a driver's license, by definition, don't drive. So they got to get there somehow, and there's not a lot of public transportation. We had the League of Women Voters was one of the petitioners, and they went around the state to see how hard it was to get to some of these places, and it was hard. And if you didn't have a car, you had to get somebody to drive you. That means somebody had to either take off from work, or we had a witness in the 2013. Oh my! This is not plugged in. Yeah, that just became loose. I'll clear that out, but there's the power supply. I'll go to the next slide really quickly. So one of the arguments against the proponents raise on voter ID is that it prevents voter fraud. But we had a stipulation in the case that the state would not offer any evidence or argument that in-person voter fraud is likely to occur in November 2012 in the absence of the photo ID law. And not only that, they stipulated that there hadn't been very many cases.
I think that did it. I plugged it into the.
Oh, okay.
I think you're fine.
They hadn't had any cases of voter fraud or any prosecutions of voter fraud. So that really took away one of the meat of the argument there. Technical difficulties. The other thing, this was the template that they came up with for care facilities. Most care facilities, that was one of the IDs you could have. None of them issued IDs. They didn't see a need for it. So they said, well, you could just use this template. Well, this is just a Word document that anybody could put anything in. And so, I mean, which brings us back to the integrity of the election argument. If you're really watering down this requirement when we actually have in place a pretty good system for identifying voters. First of all, when you register, you have to have your driver's license or your social security number, your address, your date of birth. You sign under penalty of perjury, and then you sign. Your signature is there. And when you go to the polls, you have to sign the poll book, and your signature has to match. And the poll workers verify that, and that's the system that has worked so far. And there's going to be some pictures, some photos in there. We had an expert from Rutgers, Dr. Lorraine Minity from Rutgers. She basically wrote the book on voter fraud. She testified at the trial that voter fraud across the nation is exceedingly rare, and she examined records of votes, like millions and millions of votes, and the percent came up with the number in the dozens of possibilities. I mean, I'm talking like 25 maybe voters in all those millions of votes that might possibly have voted by impersonating someone else. So this is just, these were two of the witnesses in 2013. The gentleman in the wheelchair spent 3 hours getting ID and then had to pay for it at the end. The young lady with her toddler went twice, had to go first to PICO to get a bill to show her address, then down to the voter registration office, then over to PennDOT, all with a toddler in tow, and then had to go back the second day because she didn't have all the documents that PennDOT said she needed. This lady who's seated at the table, she had just moved. She'd voted all her life in one location. She had moved to her daughter's home. She didn't have she's legally blind. She didn't drive, so she doesn't have a driver's license, no other photo ID. Was an hour from the place where you would get an ID. Her daughter had her own business, a retail shop. The daughter would have had then she did it. She closed her shop for half the day, lost all that business so she could drive her mother for an hour, wait in line, and get ID, and then come back. And then this is Taylor Floria. We talked about this is the young man on the autism spectrum. He came to the trial, and we actually had that question of how he could come to the trial, but because a courtroom is very structured and everybody's roles are defined, he could, and I was able to get close to him when I was questioning him, he could tolerate that because, and there's a judge who's in charge, and there's not this sensory stimulation, he could testify at trial. So the bottom line of all this, and I hope that, I think that the one point about protecting the integrity of the election is that if there are rules in which a large number of eligible voters may not be permitted to vote because of the rules, that you can't say that you have integrity in the election when so many eligible voters are prevented from voting. So the preliminary injunction was granted after, originally it was denied, we went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that they set a very high bar for the trial court, and they had to have complete confidence that no voter would be disenfranchised. Very high standard to meet. And on the second trial, the trial judge issued the preliminary injunction, and then a permanent injunction was issued on January 17th, 2014. And then I'm going to show you the current rules, because you don't need photo ID. After all that, you can have photo or non-photo ID. Only first-time voters in the precinct need an ID at all. All the other voters sign the book, and it's a much broader class, any employee ID, any student ID, a school district ID, but your voter registration card serves as non-photo ID. Everybody has that, and if you don't have that, you call up your county and say, hey, I lost my voter registration card, can you mail me another one? Sure, and they'll mail it right out. So everybody has one of these forms of ID. So again, election matters, because now I'm at the Department of State, and we are doing everything possible to make sure that voters participate, because it's so important that your voice is heard. And some of the things that we have done, first, I may go live, but the online voter registration, very easy. Register.votespa.com. If you know people who aren't registered, you can do it on your phone. And if you don't have a PennDOT product, what you do is you sign your name on a white piece of paper and you take a picture with your camera and upload it. It's really easy. I did it on the train. I mean, it's really easy. The deadline is October 11th. That's Tuesday. So, there are several states that require you to think and plan ahead. And humans are really bad at planning ahead. But if you want to vote on November 8th, you have to know by October 11th so you can register. That's our online voter registration application. It's just the first page. It's available in English and Spanish. That's the upload signature feature. That's from a desktop. It's much better to do it on a tablet or a phone, because you go right to the camera. On the desktop, you have to upload the file. But if you're doing it on your phone, it's really easy. So if there's any of your friends who aren't thinking they might not vote, and you just run out and get them registered, these are just slides showing the signature upload. I'm going to blow through them. Absentee voting. This is important. If you don't vote here in the Lancaster area and want to vote by absentee ballot, request it now. Request it as soon as possible. The Postal Service has changed its service delivery standards. There's no such thing as next day first class mail anywhere. It's actually 3 to 5 days. They say in the Commonwealth they can get anything in 2 days, but you can't really rely on that. So absentee ballots have to be received by the county the Friday before the election. This year that's November 4th. And that's not a postmark. It means that they have to have it in hand. We are recommending that you mail the application no later than October 21st, which is 2 weeks from tomorrow. And when you get it, you'll get it back, send it in right away, and mail it no later than October 28th to ensure that it's there on time. So if any of you are planning to vote by absentee ballot in your home county, there's a form on our website that you can download, print, sign, and mail. And this is our new thing, text. If you text PA to 2VOTE, which is 28683, you'll get to this page, which gives you everything you need to register, find your status, find your polling place, contact your county election office, contact us. There's no excuse now. You're walking around with a smartphone, you've got everything at your fingertips. that's just a screenshot of how to find your voter registration status. And I do want to say that when we were developing the online the registration application, that we engaged the Center for Civic Design, which is nationally recognized usability experts, and our application is completely compatible with screen readers. And through our association with the Disability Rights of PA, we had visually impaired voters test it and got high marks for our application. So I'm pleased to say that and everything we do at the Department of State on voting has to pass our accessibility requirements. So we try to make sure that all of our applications are accessible to voters with disabilities. This is your Find Your Polling Place screenshot, and I think that's all I have. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to tell you about one other thing, our voter education toolkit. You can go on Everyone Votes PA and download items. I just want to see if I can bring it up. So this, actually, it's not, this is Everyone Votes PA, but it doesn't look like it's displaying right. But if you go to that website, you can print these out. The top 5 things you should know. There's frequently asked questions about people. If you have questions about what rules are in effect at the polling place, what your rights are, there are PDFs. All of that. All that information is available on our regular website, votespa.com. But this is portable that you can print out and hand out. If people have questions, you can bring it with you. If you're going to be working, trying to get people to motivate them to come out to vote, we wanted everyone to have these tools available to engage voters. So with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Spicer.
Thanks for coming, everybody. As Rob mentioned, I graduated from Millersville a few years ago, and I remember what I was doing at 9:30 on a Thursday morning, and it usually involved going to a policy conference. So you're 10 steps ahead of where I would have been. As I said, this is Galahad. He's my guide dog. And what I thought I'd start out with, since we kind of have a tidy group, is could we go around quickly and just, if I get everybody's name and just got to get a sense for who's here, and I would really appreciate that, just real fast. That'd be great. Whoever wants to start.
Jen DeWalt.
Hey, Jen.
Hi. Audrey Lopez.
Hi.
Mitch Stoltzfus.
Mitch.
Ian Moore.
Bethany Cologne.
Hey.
Abraham Medali.
Name. All right. So let me start by telling you. So Rob had mentioned, Dr. Spicer had mentioned that I worked on Capitol Hill, and was also lucky enough to work for part of the group that put together Help America Vote Act. And did he leave?
Yeah.
He's with my friend. My dad's in the back there, you guys. If you all want to say hi to my dad, there's my dad. And Galahad really likes my dad. So what I thought I'd do is kind of make this a little interactive for everybody here. So I'd start out with a little story for you. When I worked on Capitol Hill, I worked for one of the jobs I had was working for the committee that put together the Help America Vote Act. So what is Help America Vote Act? Dr. Spicer mentioned HAVA. So we call it HAVA. And if you remember back a little bit, post-Florida in 2000, and it was kind of a wild election, and lots of issues with voting, lots of issues with votes being counted, how they were counted in certain ways, in certain areas, and who had a chance to vote and who didn't. And the president, Congress, and I think the American public wanted some reforms, some sweeping reforms in elections. And we got them. It was quite a bit of negotiation on the Hill and with different members, but it took about 2 years, and I had taken a job for that committee right after Florida, about 10 months after. And when I took the job, I really didn't know much about voting, and I was lucky enough to be paired with a few very gifted public policy people, and quickly got up to speed and was part of the group. So I thought I'd give you a little story about putting the bill together. One day, we received notice that we needed to go over to Senator Kennedy's hideaway. And hideaway means kind of their personal office, because he's a member of leadership and, Senator Kennedy and the Kennedy family, so quite highly regarded. So we kind of got things together, and he wanted to talk about voting accessibility and some of the disability provisions in the bill and how that would all kind of come together. So a small group of us went over, and I had my guide dog with me, and so we went in, waiting for him. He's busy, he has votes, and kind of a busy day. So his staffer, kind of a younger guy, comes over to me and says, "Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up. The senator is very particular about other dogs being here, because he has a dog." And I was like, "Oh boy, how's this gonna work?" So he's like, "I might need to see if one of your staffers could take your dog out of the room." So I was a little bothered. I was like, "Oh boy, just didn't expect this." Senator Kennedy comes in, sees my dog, and gets really excited. And he's like, "Oh, I have a dog." So if you all remember, Senator Kennedy had a dog, and his dog would come with him to Capitol Hill all the time. So he says, "Hey, would you guys mind? I'm gonna go get my dog, and the two dogs can kind of hang out and have a good time." And so keep in mind, we're there to do business, and I'm there with my boss, and he goes and gets his dog, and I have my dog, and the dog. So now the dogs are like running around the room basically, and this is Capitol Hill. So short story. End of the short story is that we got what we needed to get done there, but I just thought it was an interesting kind of glimmer of, you think about public policy and how it doesn't have this human side to it, but it really does. So we walked out of the room with two dogs and a very happy Senator Kennedy. Not only did his dog get to play with my dog, but he had the chance to he got what he wanted in the bill too. So I just wanted to start out with two. Could we all get a piece of paper out? I want to do a little interactive activity. Everybody set?
Yep.
All right. So, let me ask you 3 questions. First, write a name of a color on the piece of paper. Not your favorite color, a color. Second, draw a piece of furniture. You're not showing this in any way, so don't worry about the artistic side to it. And then the third would be draw a horse and make it a flying horse and give your horse a name. And then when you're all done, put your name on the piece of paper. So since we have a smaller group, if it's cool,
Color, furniture, flying horse, name.
yeah, so name of the horse too.
Oh, name of the horse.
Name your horse, and put your name on the piece of paper. So since we have a small group, could a couple people share kind of where they came down on this?
I have green. I drew a sofa. The flying horse, he's got wings coming out of the back, and his name is Henry, and my name is Rob.
All right, where did you put your name?
At the bottom.
Okay. Who else?
I'll go.
Thanks.
It's Marian.
Thanks.
The color I wrote was blue. I did a very
It's a very good flying horse.
All right.
rudimentary table, flying horse named Pegasus,
Great. Where'd you put your name?
Right under Pegasus.
Okay. Somebody else. Abe, how about you, buddy?
I
All right.
got mine.
All right.
I chose blue, I drew a sofa, and my horse's name is Leo.
All right. And how about his wings? How does he fly?
It looks like a dragon's wings.
Okay. And then where did you put your name?
I put it like around the horse's belly.
Okay. Your name. How about your name? On the piece of paper.
Yeah, all around the horse's belly.
Okay, okay. How about one more?
I put the color blue.
Okay.
I drew a sofa. The horse's name is Sailor, and I put my name Jen under the horse.
Okay. So what I wanted to do was, excuse me, and it's kind of a simple example here, is kind of relate this to voting. In that voting is a very kind of, when you look at your ballot and you kind of go through the process of voting, it's a very, you're going to fall back on a lot of the habits that you have about reviewing a piece of paper or looking at something. So, no surprise, most people are probably red or blue. They didn't say your favorite, it was just name one. So where do you kind of think of immediately? Usually furniture, it's a sofa or bed. The horse is always flying with wings. So the horse could also be flying with a jetpack, or he could be, kind of like some kind of skis, or something like that. A lot of people name their horse Pegasus. A lot of people don't. But and then the interesting part was I kind of messed it up. Usually I would say, where do you put your name first? Most people would put their name at the top. Just something you would do kind of in school, instinctually. But in this case, since I said it last, it sounds like most people put it at the bottom, which makes sense because you kind of followed kind of the way it was going. So this sort of loops back to voting and the way that in voting we kind of have deadlines and we have processes we need to follow. And a lot of that is how we fall back on things we've learned and the things we do every day. Voting is a simple process, but it can be also complex. So I just wanted to kind of share that with you. On the Help America Vote Act, as I said, it was a bipartisan effort on the Hill. It took about 2 years. This kind of goes big picture to what Marian said. You have 50 states. You have all the territories. You have over 9,000 counties. Dozens of thousands of polling precincts. And all that comes together. And you have over 190 million eligible voters. All of that comes together over a period of time in the fall to elect a president and down ballot. Quite a process. And you have election officials that are carrying that out. So what we attempted to do with the Help America Vote Act was to enact reforms to that process, which is very much a state-driven process. And what we did is gave states standards they had to meet to receive federal dollars to buy new equipment. That equipment now is becoming outdated, so I think soon you may see a infusion of new dollars to buy some new equipment, I think. And that's just kind of me speaking personally. Also with Help America Vote Act, we were focused very much on accessibility, and Marian mentioned it as well. Making sure that all voters, whether it be someone with a disability, language needs, mobility needs, whatever it might be, that vote should be private and independent. So I have a few here. I actually brought a bunch. Can you pass out a few of those little folders there? That'd be great. So I wanted to share this with you. It's a folder that we put together at the commission, and we've gotten this out to thousands of voters across the country. A couple of the disability groups came to us several months ago, and they said, how can we get our basic rights out there to people? What's going on in elections. So we put this together and made sure it was very accessible. So it's brailled, it's large print. It's also written in very plain language, so that very understandable. And then on the back we did a QR code. So it's been kind of a hit. People love it. But things like that came out of HAVA, in that the language in here is extremely important. I think the biggest part there to this is the vote has to be, no matter what your challenges are on election day, it has to be private and independent. You should at least be allowed that opportunity. Now, if you want to bring someone in with you, great. But if you want to vote privately and independently at the polls, you should have that ability should be there for you. And I think we're getting somewhere. We've come a long way, but there's quite a ways to go too. Lots of different disabilities out there. An aging population, and a lot of people that I think do a great job with what they do every day, but they may not even realize they have a disability. Someone's maybe older and just has lower vision, and they need the print to be blown up just a little bit on the ballot. So the election officials kind of are working, on ways to make sure all of those needs are met. And we've come a long way, but I think we have a ways to go as well. And as I said, with HAVA, I think, the purchasing the machines was a great step. The standards that the states had to meet was certainly, I think, a needed thing. Issues like provisional ballots and military voting, and making sure all that was tightened up and strong enough for federal law. They're all great things. I think we did miss the mark on some areas, but legislation is tricky. One area where you're seeing now, that you're hearing a lot about in the news, is security. So how secure are our elections, and how susceptible are we to hacking? So from my standpoint, kind of from the DC standpoint, so you read a lot about it, right? I mean, it's all in the news right now, and different candidates have different views, but our elections across this country are very secure. Where you're seeing folks, the hackers, kind of nibble around the edges is what the statewide databases, these databases, and they've pinged a few of them and kind of been able to touch a few of them but not get in. And as far as the machinery is concerned, machinery is kind of very, very varied across the country. It's very different in different localities. So to get into machinery, you would literally have to have a large, massive group of people moving from polling place to polling place, somehow having smart cards and infiltrating systems. So that system is pretty rock solid, largely because of the diffuse nature of our elections. And then the third area is kind of the nightly reporting systems. And as with the databases, pretty strong. Now, pretty secure. Now, could we do better in some of these areas? Probably. And I think as we move on to post, a really productive and a very positive November 8th, as far as the vote and how security goes, I think that maybe you'll see some dive into some federal dollars go toward making systems a little stronger and preventing potential hacking, because it's certainly in the news these days. And then looking at other issues that I think they're obviously ongoing in elections, and you hear about them, and they're so important. Is that how do we make sure that it's easy for you to vote, and there is a certain element that is concerned about any cheating, and that's something that's certainly addressed. But as far as I'm concerned, I just feel strongly that everyone, if you want to vote, you should be able to vote, and how can we make that happen for you? So I thought I'd close with And I miss Letterman. He's gone, but I've become a big Fallon fan. I don't know about you guys, but so I wrote down 6 things, just 6. So didn't want to come up with 10 because I figured I had time for Q&A. 6 things that you could do to prepare for Election Day. And I think a lot of you have done most of them, but you could share it with your friends maybe. So the first one is register. Sounds like everybody's done that. That is the first and very important part. Second one, and Marian had mentioned it, is find a way to look at your sample ballot of your area. Find a way to kind of begin to educate yourself about how that's going to look when you walk into the polling place. Because if you walk in and there's a line and it's busy and sometimes, just a little turned around, you just want to make sure that you're comfortable with the vote and how the process is going. Third one would be read up and just make sure you're informed about the issues, how you want to vote. Fourth one, and she touched on it as well, is scout things out. So where are you going to vote? If you realize that you can't vote at the polling place, look at the absentee option if you do qualify for that. And the fifth one, and we haven't mentioned it yet, if you take anything away from today, make sure you vote. Just find the time, find the 20 minutes, find the hour that it takes for you to go to the polls and vote on Election Day. Now the sixth one is kind of a star. It's kind of a extra credit point. It's getting a little late in the game for this, but you could certainly kind of put out the feelers if you're interested, and you could look at how this might work for you in the future. Your local election office, so Lancaster County has an elections office, an elections director. Every county does. They always need help, especially around this time of year. So how could you volunteer for them? How could you possibly be a poll worker? No better way to kind of learn the process and see the process than to do it hands-on on Election Day. And if you're a poll worker, you get paid. So I would encourage you to look at those things, especially number 6, because it's something that really gives you the frontline view of democracy. So thanks.
So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll leave it open to the audience first to get first dibs.
Do you want us to stay over here?
I
or
guess we can,
both be over here?
yeah, we can both go
Yeah.
over to the table. Do you want me to, or go over? Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Pat, I'm right here
Yeah,
next to
yeah.
you.
Move over.
You wanna share?
Yes.
Just on the last thing you mentioned about volunteering opportunities.
Uh-huh.
I work a lot with people who are not yet citizens. Would they be able to volunteer? Like, is it a requirement to volunteer at a polling place or even for the election board?
Throw that to you.
Yeah, so usually to be a poll worker, even to be appointed as a clerk, you need to be a qualified registered elector of the county. And also, but that doesn't mean, like, for example, I will tell you, I need to look something up though, but if they have bilingual skills, if they're bilingual, that might be an area where they could volunteer, but I'd have to check that. And also, I don't think there would be any requirement if they, for example, Lancaster County might, if they're Spanish-speaking, people are fluent in Spanish, they could probably use some help in the office to help voters because there's a fairly large Hispanic community here in Lancaster County. So that would be a great way to help. But as far as being a poll worker or actually being a partisan poll watcher, you have to be a registered elector. But I will, if you give me your email address, I'll get the answer to that of whether they could work in the office without, but the answer is yes, and also whether they could work as an interpreter.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll tell you, when we were putting together Help America Vote Act, there's a provision in there to encourage high school students to be volunteers at the polls. So in some places that can be poll worker, in some places it is somebody that helps out in the morning and maybe runs and gets some things for the poll workers and things like that. So and I think another place to look at too would be contact the local Lancaster office here as well and just see what's available. And you're exactly right. There's such a need. I mean, so
Right.
I don't know what the laws are, but I mean, especially in Lancaster City, there is such a need.
Right, and Randall Wenger is the election director in Lancaster County. He's a good guy, and he runs a pretty good shop. So I may even give him a call when I get back and say, hey, you may get some calls from Milledgeville students today.
I have one that sort of overlaps because Pat, you brought up the security issue, and then there are issues of access. What do both of you think of the possibility of online voting as opposed to in-person voting at some point in the future? Do you think that's a possibility, and what are the upsides and downsides of that?
You want to go first?
Yeah, this is a hot one. So I have to preface it with these would be my views, these are my personal views, and since I work for federal government, I think that a couple years ago, this was kind of rolling down the tracks, and that we were headed in that direction. That in some way, shape, or form, maybe in the next 10 years, you're going to be able to, at a minimum, log in at home, pull up the ballot, print it out, fill it out, and then get it to your polling place. Maybe walk in and drop it off. However, recently with this security issue, and I mean, I do a lot of the press work in our office and see a lot of the stories, and I will tell you that there are lots of stories and just lots of interest in security. I mean, there's all kinds of polling data that like 60% of Americans are concerned about the security of their ballot. I mean, it has become quickly in the past 3 months maybe a very hot topic. So in light of that, and it could just be because of the current kind of climate, and it may calm down, but this has certainly sparked it up. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And I think that's a lot because of security.
This is me. I agree that it's not going to happen. I have a different take on it, and I want to focus on the voting transaction. Voting transaction is completely different than any other transaction you do online because it's anonymous. So there are two issues. So unlike your bank account where you have your checkbook register or you know what you did, you have a record that you can go back to. Online voting currently does not have a traceable way to go back to your vote without violating constitutional provisions that require secrecy on the ballot. Pennsylvania has a constitutional provision that says the secrecy of the ballot must be preserved. So those are two issues. But what the computer security experts say about online voting is that we won't see it in our lifetime. Department of Homeland Security has called it the biggest national security threat. And the Department of Defense spent, I think, about $100 million looking at that for military and overseas voters, and they have canceled that program because they recognize it cannot be done securely and privately. So the internet infrastructure as we know it today, I don't think has the ability. Now, some of the things there, I think remote delivery of ballots, if we could guarantee that the ballot is correct so there's so many different things as far as the users. There's the county's network, then there's the user's own computer, and what malware might be living on that computer. I mean, so the current architecture probably won't support it. If that architecture were to change, or there were ways that we could verify what they call end-to-end verifiable voting, if we could have that, then maybe, but I hang around a lot with the computer geeks, and they're telling me not in my lifetime, I'm pretty old, but not in their lifetime either. So I think it's really far down the road, and what we should really want are secure, accurate, verifiable, and auditable elections. And that's what we need to go for so that we can inspire confidence. We want people to have confidence that the outcome of the election is the correct one.
Yeah, I mean, I just agree that, it's interesting because I understand the convenience side of it, right? And you do see a couple states, there are some states. Maryland has a tool that if you're someone with a disability, you can log in remotely, pull up the ballot, print it out, and then, fill it out, and then get it in by mail. But even that's recently getting under attack for security, just from critics. So I don't know. I think, we're kind of reverting back in a way to some ways of the past, in that previous to Florida 15 years ago, you had a lot of, the whole thing was punch cards, and then you went more toward electronic systems, and now we're swinging back to some more paper. So it is just an interesting process, and sort of like that game we play with the paper, right in the paper, that kind of human nature, and people kind of revert back to what they know. But at some point, we probably do need to move forward now that, the iPhone, most iPhones are way more advanced than any election machine out there.
It's true, but also very insecure.
Yes, true.
Just a question for
Yes.
Marian. You had mentioned at the primary election, they were to be asking for,
In
identity.
2012, in 2012.
Okay, because I know at my polling place, I've never been asked for any identification, and I've never seen them ask anyone for identification.
Well, so there was a lot of revolt from the poll worker. The voter ID was very, very unpopular with the election administration community. The county election directors hated it, the poll workers hated it, because they felt that it was a solution, a problem in search of a solution. There was no problem, they really didn't need this. So a lot of the poll workers didn't follow it, and also because the law was passed so close to the election, there wasn't a lot of time to train poll workers. But as I said, it's only first time. If you've been voting for a long time, I've been voting in my same precinct for 24 years. They don't ask me for ID. They're like, how are the kids? It was this whole big community thing. So, the only time you would be asked for ID is if you were first time in that precinct.
In your personal opinion, will we ever see election day changed to a weekend like most developed nations?
Good question. You can go ahead.
Well, that would require a constitutional amendment in Pennsylvania, but what I would certainly be supportive of early voting period, no excuse absentee voting, or an early voting period, and I would also be very much in support of same-day registration during that early voting period. That was sort of the model that North Carolina had that was extremely successful, in which they had the early voting period several weeks, including weekends, before the election, same-day registration during that period, and then they cut it off. So 3 days before the election, you either went to early voting and you registered and voted at the same time, or you were already registered and you could go on election day. It was a secure way. It would encourage participation. They were in the top 10 of voter participation during that period. So those are some of the reforms I'd like to see, but that requires the legislature to act.
And I'll just add on to that, and some real positive things that have occurred across the country. So it's different in each state, obviously. But I will tell you that when we put the legislation together on Capitol Hill, I'd like to sit here and tell you that we came up with everything, and we put the bill together, and no, there was a commission that was scheduled by the president, just a bipartisan, led by former Presidents Carter and Ford. And they came back with, it was kind of a blue ribbon panel. They came back with draft legislation, basically, in the back room, and said, hey, this is what we're thinking. We looked at this really hard. Both Democrats and Republicans in leadership, my office, other offices, took the bill and just pretty much turned it into legislative language, tweaked it up a bit. But in their recommendations were the idea of early voting and how important that was, and how important it was to make the vote just more open and more accessible to people across the country. So it has to be done kind of state by state, and to do it on a larger level federally as well. But one of their recommendations was to make a national holiday, for voting. And obviously that didn't make it in the bill, but I think we are moving, to answer your question, trending much more toward this idea of elections being spread out a little more. Now, it's taking time, but we are moving in that direction.